You were never supposed to hear this. The following testimony was buried beneath 200 years of silence. And if you feel something watching you as I speak, that's not just your imagination. In the hills of Mercer County, Kentucky, past the dying oaks and fields that haven't bloomed since the War of 1812 stands the skeletal husk of a town called Pleasant Hill. Officially, it was a Shaker religious commune, celibate, communal, pacifist. But unofficially, it became something else entirely, a machine, a human laboratory. And over the course of 27 years, 312 people vanished without explanation. No bodies, no arrests, no investigations that ever made it past the first week. The names were erased, the families silenced, the records sealed. But documents never burned completely. And some souls screamed aloud to stay buried. You've heard of cults. You've heard of manipulation. But Pleasant Hill was different. It wasn't built by one charismatic lunatic. It was orchestrated by a dynasty, a bloodline of American aristocrats who weaponized faith itself not to save souls, but to strip them clean. The Richardson family. They didn't just lead the community. They engineered it like a system, a formula, a blueprint for absolute spiritual control. And it worked. For nearly 3 decades, no one escaped. No one questioned. Not until one man did. And he died the same night. This is not a ghost story. This is not fiction. This is American history, the kind that only survives in locked archives and whispered warnings. What happened at Pleasant Hill was a madness. It was method. The people who disappeared, they didn't run away. They didn't die naturally. They were processed, recycled, used, the same way ancient priest kings used offerings in Mesopotamia, or how certain Cold War programs tested civilian loyalty in plain sight. You were told America's darkness started with MK Ultra. You were wrong, and I'm going to prove it. But once you hear what I'm about to reveal, you can't go back to who you were. That part of you, the one that still believes this country runs on law and order, on goodness and truth, will be gone, forever, still here. Then we begin. The year was 1807, a year carved into stone at the entrance to Pleasant Hill. Not just the founding date of a Shaker commune, but the genesis of something engineered for control. They came under the banner of purity, discipline, harmony, divine order. But behind the hymns and handmade furniture was a machine, and at its center stood a man, Samuel Richardson. He didn't come from nothing. His lineage traced back to English descendants, wealthy landowners who had once burned heretics for sport and sold their own cousins into indentured servitude. Under the guise of salvation, he knew how power operated, and more importantly, he knew how to hide it. Samuel was tall, severe, immaculate, a man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. His eyes did it for him. His sermons were less scripture than spellwork words calibrated to trigger shame, fear, obedience. Around him, grown men wept, women confessed, and children stopped speaking entirely. And then there was Martha, his wife by blood, his sister in public. Soft-spoken, pale, with eyes that never blinked, she handled what Samuel would not. The whisper work, the pruning of minds. She knew what broke people. And more terrifying, she knew how to rebuild them in her image, together. They forged a sacred order, but it was never about God. They stripped names and gave numbers, broke marriages and called it spiritual purity, assigned jobs based not on skill, but loyalty. The moment you entered Pleasant Hill, your past ceased to exist. You were now property, and most accepted it, willingly, because the Richardsons didn't dominate by force. They used something far more effective: guilt, divine guilt, cosmic shame. Every doubt you had, a test from God. Every question, a temptation from Satan. The only cure, submission. And so they built it piece by piece. Dormitories arranged in perfect symmetry, work schedules tailored to exhaustion, worship sessions designed not for praise, but surveillance, and always someone watching. You see, Pleasant Hill was a prototype. There were rules at Pleasant Hill, hundreds of them, some written, most not. Wake before dawn. Never speak during meals. Confess your thoughts every night. No locked doors. No private letters. No questions. But behind every rule was something far more sinister, a test. You were never told when you were being tested. That was the point. They watched for hesitation, monitored your posture, timed how long it took you to say amen. Every word you spoke, every pause, every breath was measured. And at the top of the surveillance pyramid stood Caleb Richardson, Samuel's younger brother, the architect, of control. He didn't believe in God. He believed in systems. A former surveyor with a mind like a ledger book and the emotional range of a snake, he installed whisper tubes into the walls, stationed young children near confessional doors to listen and report, created observation rotations under the guise of spiritual mentorship. In Pleasant Hill, nothing was private, ever. They had dossiers, handwritten files on every member, fears, habits, secret sins. They used them not just to punish, but to shape. Rebecca Richardson, Samuel's daughter, was a prodigy in this. At just 28, she had broken more minds than any military interrogator. She called it spiritual reshaping. The process was simple. Isolate the subject, strip their identity, then flood them with affection until they craved her approval like oxygen. Within weeks, they weren't just compliant, they were grateful. But here's what chilled even visiting inspectors. No one cried, no one screamed, no one begged to leave, because by the time they realized what was happening to them, it was already done. Visitors to Pleasant Hill spoke of a strange silence, not peaceful, but sterile. Children didn't laugh, adults didn't argue. It was as if the entire population had been dipped in wax and trained to smile on command. And when someone slipped, when a thoughtless comment hinted at rebellion, they vanished. Quietly, efficiently, the official records called them transferred. But there was no transfer, no letters, no return, just silence. Over 312 names disappeared from the ledgers between 1807 and 1834, and no one outside ever questioned it, because the Richardsons didn't just control their community, they controlled the narrative. And narrative, my friend, is the first weapon of every empire. Before Waco, before Jonestown, before the alphabet agencies learned how to bend a population's mind without touching a single hair, the Richardson family had already mastered it. It didn't matter how strong you were, how educated, how skeptical. Within 6 months, you would believe that freedom was the real sin and that obedience was your salvation. This wasn't religion, it was programming, and it worked. It was the winter of 1812 when the first real fracture appeared. The snow came early that year, blanketing Pleasant Hill in a silence even deeper than usual. But inside the meeting hall, something stirred, something dangerous. His name was Brother Thomas Whitman. He had been there from the beginning. One of the first converts, a wealthy merchant, widowed, broken by grief, and desperate for purpose. The Richardsons welcomed him with open arms, and more importantly, open ledgers. You see, Thomas donated everything, his property, his business, even his late wife's jewelry. He believed in the promise of a spiritual utopia. He believed Samuel was the vessel of divine will, and for 5 years, he served. He built the fields, taught new converts, and balanced the books. He knew the numbers. He knew the shipments. He saw everything. So when the math stopped making sense, he noticed. Isaiah Richardson, the cousin, was reporting profits from the seed business that didn't. He matched the shipments, the furniture operation. Under Jeremiah claimed production numbers that didn't align with supply orders. At worst of all, the food, Pleasant Hill reported over 400 members. But the food stock only fed to 150. Where were the rest? Thomas brought it to a meeting. Quietly, humbly, just a few figures, just some questions. He never raised his voice. But the air changed the moment he spoke. Samuel smiled. That same saintly smile he used when burying a lie. Martha lowered her eyes and gripped her prayer book like a weapon. And Caleb stood up and placed himself silently between Thomas and the door. In that moment, Thomas wasn't a brother anymore. He was a liability. The meeting ended with Samuel offering a soft benediction. He praised Thomas's zeal and asked the community to pray for his troubled heart. That night, Thomas was served special tea prepared by Sister Hannah, the herbalist. She said it would calm his mind. By morning, he was dead. The cause, natural causes. His body, removed before breakfast. His papers, collected, burned, erased. Only one witness remained, Sister Mary Caldwell, a young cleaner. She noticed the blue fingernails, the bitter almond smell, the foam wipe from his mouth. She never spoke of it. Not for 37 years, because in Pleasant Hill, truth was not a virtue, it was a death sentence. After Thomas Whitman's death, Pleasant Hill didn't unravel. It tightened. What should have been a scandal became a sermon. Samuel Richardson preached that morning with tears in his eyes, speaking of Brother Thomas's spiritual confusion and redemption through suffering. The community wept not for Thomas, but for themselves, terrified they might carry the same infection of doubt. And while they prayed, the Richardson machine recalibrated. Brother Ezekiel Samuel's eldest introduced labor intensives, longer days in the fields, fewer breaks, mandatory prayer circles every evening, led by Rebecca and Martha, designed to unearth even the smallest seeds of disobedience. Each meeting began with silence, a stillness so sharp it carved the room open like a blade. And then one person would speak, confessing impure thoughts, moments of laziness, a flicker of skepticism, and like clockwork, others followed. The more you confessed, the safer you became. That's how they controlled them, through ritualized guilt. But the true brilliance, the terrifying brilliance, wasn't in their punishments. It was in their rewards. You see, some members were praised, not with money or food, but with something far more addictive, significance. They were called examples of purity, given more visible tasks, mentioned by name in sermons, allowed to lead songs, and once that hook was in your soul, you'd say anything, do anything to keep it. You'd betray your brother, you'd spy on your wife, you'd erase your own doubts just to be seen. This wasn't just a commune, it was a laboratory in behavioral control, operated decades before behavioral psychology had a name. And behind it all, the matriarch, Mother Sarah Richardson, Samuel's own mother, frail, ancient, her voice barely above a whisper. Outsiders saw her as a relic, a spiritual anchor. But inside the walls, she was the final authority. Her orders were few, but absolute, and when she called someone to her chambers, they rarely came out the same. What they built wasn't just spiritual, it was generational. Interlocking roles, unbreakable rituals, a bloodline acting as both clergy and secret police. And that's when it becomes clear, the disappearances weren't random, they were necessary. Calculated removals, patterned psychological purges. Every transfer was a controlled variable in a grand experiment. How far can the human mind bend? Before it breaks, you're not watching a story of faith. You're watching a system of control perfected. And it's not just in Pleasant Hill. It never left. You think this was just one isolated commune, some anomaly buried in Kentucky soil. No, Pleasant Hill wasn't the disease. It was the prototype, a trial run for psychological obedience, an early draft of something that now lives in your workplace, your school, your church, and yes, even in your home. Because after Pleasant Hill fell silent, certain men in Washington took interest. You see, the records weren't destroyed. They were relocated, sealed under religious exemption laws and national preservation. And the ones who handled those documents, they didn't work for the church, they worked for the Office of Strategic Services, the early form of what we now call the CIA. Coincidence? Or did the mind control methods of Pleasant Hill ritualized guilt, confession-driven obedience, multi-tier surveillance systems somehow find their way into Cold War black programs, into MKUltra, into modern behavior modification research? Don't believe it? Then answer this. Why did Pleasant Hill's dissolution records go missing in 1953? Why did every living descendant of the Richardson line change their surnames between 1947 and 1951? Why do satellite images of the area still show military-grade fencing around the ruins, maintained by a private contractor with no public record? You're not looking at a collapsed religious community, you're looking at the fossilized skeleton of a behavioral weapon, and early American psychological operation that succeeded. And the methods didn't just survive, they evolved. How else do you explain the surveillance of emotion we now call social media? The rituals of public confession now called terms of service? The algorithmic punishment system we call shadow banning? It's the same formula. Strip identity, reward compliance, punish deviance, monitor everything. And if you're watching this, you're already on a list. Not because you're dangerous, but because you're thinking. And thought, in a system built on obedience, is the first rebellion. So I'm going to ask you now, if you've made it this far, type this in the comments. I am not afraid to remember. Say it twice. Once for the world that forgot, and once for the part of yourself that just woke up. Because what happened at Pleasant Hill wasn't an end. It was a beginning. And you've just inherited the burden of knowing. You were taught that history is a line, a clean timeline, one event after another. But that's a lie, just another tool to keep you disoriented, because in reality, history is a spiral. Patterns repeat, methods refine, and those who master the spiral rule it. Pleasant Hill wasn't just a moment. It was a cycle, a ritual, And after its official collapse in 1834, after 312 people vanished, after the land was quietly sold under proxy ownership, do you know who bought the property? A holding company, untraceable, paper trails that loop into oblivion, the name on the deed, Orpheum Agricultural Trust, founded in 1835, still exists today. You won't find a website, just a tax-exempt shell used to purchase farmland across Kentucky, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And every property it acquires has three things in common: rural isolation, foreign religious use, and underground infrastructure. Why would a farm need that? Because what they built at Pleasant Hill went underground literally. According to fragments recovered from the 1937 Kentucky Flood Survey, beneath the original commune were 5 sealed chambers, accessible only through a stone shaft behind the meeting hall altar, not listed on blueprints, not acknowledged in any Shaker records. When a team of WPA surveyors attempted to open one of these substructures, 3 of them went missing within 48 hours. The incident was labeled accidental exposure to fumes, and the site was reclassified as hazardous. End of story. But a leak 1972 memo from the Department of Energy, yes, Energy references that same area. It lists Pleasant Hill as a site theta, noting archival value in pre-modern control architectures. That's not a religious site. That's a testing ground. And this is the part they don't want you to see. The Richardson family had access to ancient texts. Visitors described black books without titles and scrolls written in a dead hand. They weren't just building a cult. They were reconstructing something far older, something predating Christ, predating democracy, a system of control, rooted in frequency, symbolism, and sacrifice. They weren't fanatics. They were engineers reactivating an ancient operating system inside a so-called Christian shell. And they succeeded. So ask yourself, if the spiral repeats, where's the next Pleasant Hill? And how would you even know you were in it? There's something no one tells you about control systems, whether cultic, governmental, or psychological. They don't exist just to hold you down. They exist to rewrite what you think freedom is, and Pleasant Hill did exactly that. You see, obedience wasn't demanded, it was seduced. Resistance wasn't crushed, it was redirected, made to feel selfish, even evil. And the longer you stayed, the more the walls of your mind were rearranged. That's why no one ran, because by the time you realized you were a prisoner, you believed you deserved the cage. The deeper mystery isn't just how the Richardsons controlled people, it's what they were trying to prepare them for. According to decrypted journal entries from Sister Patience Richardson, Samuel's youngest daughter, and the community's record keeper, there were whispers of an arrival, a convergence. Every 7 years, they performed a closed ritual never named, never spoken aloud. Members fasted in silence. Doors were sealed. No one outside ever saw what happened. But afterward, 1 or 2 members were always taken by the spirit and never seen again. That phrase, taken by the spirit, appears dozens of times in the journals, always linked to dreams of the shining gate beneath the floorboards, and a mouth that speaks in numbers. This wasn't just religious metaphor. This was contact. You think this is far-fetched? Then ask yourself, why did the Department of Energy classify Pleasant Hill as theta rather than alpha or gamma in esoteric circles? Theta is the gateway state between consciousness and deep trance, the zone where psychic input is most accessible, the precise frequency associated with channeling. Pleasant Hill wasn't just building control systems, it was trying to reach something. And whatever it reached answered. Locals spoke of lights in the forest, cattle mutilations, entire families refusing to speak for weeks after hearing the chant in the trees. And those who tried to dig into the ruins, they were warned, always by the same pale man with gray eyes, who introduced himself only as Brother Ezra. No one knows where Ezra came from, but one thing's certain, the Richardsons never needed a resurrection, because something or someone has kept their machine running. The question now isn't what happened, it's what's still happening beneath your feet. You think you're outside the system. You're not. You're in the updated version, the one Pleasant Hill prophesied. The digital cathedral, the panopticon built not with stone and sermons, but with screens and silence. Let me show you. At Pleasant Hill, members confess their doubts in daily circles. Today, you do it online. Voluntarily, you tell algorithms what you love, what you fear, what keeps you up at night. You rate your food, you tag your friends, you record your dreams. They don't need confession rooms anymore. You built them. At Pleasant Hill, the Richardsons monitored language. Certain words were discouraged, Others required permission. Now, the platforms you scroll every day flag, ban, or shadow your thoughts before you've even finished typing them. Welcome to Spiritual Obedience, version 2.0, and remember the absences, the 312 who vanished. Today, they don't disappear you physically, they vanish your reach, your voice, your influence. Ask the wrong questions and you don't get. At prison, you get filtered, silenced by design, not bars. They refine the method. No need for death to you when dopamine works better. The scariest part, it's working. You've seen the eyes of men who've stopped thinking, who parrot talking points, who twitch when you say something unapproved. You know this isn't just about politics. It's about programming. It started with prayer bells. Now it's notifications. At Pleasant Hill, identity was erased by roads and renaming. Today, it's pronouns and profile templates. Your face is scanned. Your opinions tracked. Your community compliance score, invisible, but real. And who built this framework? The descendants. The Orpheum Trust rebranded in 2003. New name, Ashcroft Bioanalytics, publicly listed as an agricultural biotech firm. But dig into their patent sensor arrays, neurochemical feedback loops, adaptive conditioning software. They never left. They evolved. The same bloodline that orchestrated obedience in candlelit halls now engineers your dopaminergic leash in real time, and you carry it willingly in your pocket, in your hand, in your home. Pleasant Hill wasn't the horror, it was the manual, and now you're living inside its final chapter. The spiral didn't break, it tightened, and unless you remember the beginning, you'll never see how it ends. Now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Not the names, not the patterns, not the structure that slithered out of Pleasant Hill and wrapped itself around the world. This wasn't just a cult. It was a seed planted in 1807, watered with blood, silence, and obedience, and now, fully grown, its branches reach into every corner of your life. You were never taught about the Richardsons in school. You were never shown their records. You were never told 312 people vanished without a single investigation. Why? Because truth isn't buried. It's hidden in plain sight under religious tax codes, under foundation grants, under phrases like "for your safety." But here's what they never anticipated. You, the man who feels something's wrong but can't explain why. The one who doesn't buy the slogans, who senses the hollow in the words of politicians, pastors, CEOs, who watches history repeat but remembers. You've been called paranoid, conspiratorial, dangerous. But the only thing dangerous is how right you are. Pleasant Hill was never meant to stay in Kentucky. It was meant to scale, and it did. From cult to commune, commune to operation, operation to institution, and now, it's the operating system of the modern world. Look around. Guilt-based obedience, groupthink disguised as virtue, safe zones that feel like velvet prisons, and at the top always a smiling figure, with gentle eyes and absolute control. So what do you do now? You remember. You carry this knowledge like a weapon. You speak it aloud. You pass it down, because this kind of truth, once known, splinters you. You are no longer just a man in the system. You are the crack in its foundation. And once a man cracks, he can't be resealed. So if you've come this far, if the spiral opened for you, type it again. I am not afraid to remember. I am not afraid to remember. Let them see it. Let the algorithm choke on it. Because if enough of us remember, the spiral loses its power, and Pleasant Hill becomes not the beginning of control, but the end of it. This is not just a story, it's a map out of the maze. But you must choose, forget, and return to sleep, or awaken and never be the same again. If you're still here, you're not like them. Like it, share it, subscribe, and prove it.